The Treaty of Chaguaramas was signed on the 4th of July, 1973.
We are one of the original signatories to the Treaty of Chaguaramas.
The question was, how could we in the small islands be involved in this community when, as associated states not responsible for our external affairs, we had to seek the permission of the British government to join a treaty.
In the year 1973, Caricom, the Caribbean Community and Common Market, sounded its horn from Port of Spain, Trinidad, and filled with the hopes and aspirations of 12 member nations, set sail, bound for the destination of its dreams.
I was chairman of the Associated States at the time, and I had a meeting when I was premier with Prime Minister Barrow and Manley and Burnham and a minister from Trinidad in Barbados, and I suggested that the Big Four should go ahead and sign up and let us have the treaty in existence. After the treaty is in existence, which we all negotiated, including all the islands of the Eastern Caribbean, we would then sign at a later date. But in other words, let it be signed. We'll then ask permission of the British to join, and we would then have the treaty encompassing us all.
The first oil shock, which led to the first international economic crisis of the 1970s, was in May of 1973. So immediately Caricom came on. In fact, it came on in a very difficult international economic environment.
Since then, after almost 3 decades, Caribbean peoples have been grappling with a mix of doubt and optimism.
But what I'm very impatient about is that we have not had freedom of movement of labor.
And I think what is needed is tremendous patience and not loss of that vision.
There are a number of functional ways in which we are serving as a single economic space on the environment.
We haven't gone very far with it. I don't think that we are creating the hopes and aspirations that should develop Caricom, that should make Caricom come alive, if you know what I mean.
We have been a very effective voice. It does not mean we have not encountered difficulties and not run into stumbling blocks.
I don't think we're even going in the right direction. I don't think we're thinking about it in that way.
What we have done is to forge a common position on all the issues that arise.
I do not think that Caricom has yet fully defined its position.
I'm disappointed in some ways and happy in other ways.
Despite this ambivalence, there was this sobering recognition, anchored in the reality that the Caribbean's best chance for the future was to engage each other in a tighter, more cohesive group. Trends in world politics would have had it no other way. The turbulent decade of the 1970s was no less significant for the Caribbean than it was for a global community that had been buffeted by a variety of political and economic storms. The Cold War was on, and the international climate was becoming affected by the worst global recession in 50 years. The world economy grew by only 1.2%, just a third of the rate for the previous decade. The oil crisis further compounded the problem, causing the turmoil to spread far and wide. And for the peoples of the Caribbean, the years of hope gave way to the stark and obvious reality that we must either integrate or perish. If our early Caribbean leaders could have foreseen the perilous journey awaiting them on the horizons of the 70s and 80s, they might have had greater regard for the prophetic demands of the Chaguaramas Treaty. The international waters became fraught with difficulties at every twist and turn of the tide, battering our leaders' resolve to cooperate and rendering them vulnerable to the tidal pressures of a raging Cold War.
Despite détente, peaceful coexistence, the balance of terror between the two superpowers, the United States of America and the Soviet Union, there was genuine tension, and each side was looking for souls.
Most of the independent countries in Caricom were members of the non-aligned movement, and therefore were committed to a principle of not being fixed adherents of either side. Of course, in practice, it didn't quite work out that way, because the political conditionality attached to assistance from either side was very high.
Jamaica at that time, under Michael Manley, was pursuing a policy of democratic socialism, which incurred the hostility of the United States. And Guyana, under President Burnham, was also pursuing a very active role in the non-aligned movement. Both countries were very strongly supportive of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, which at that time was interpreted as having Cold War implications.
And countries like Cuba discovered, although not a member of CARICOM, that the costs of adherence to the socialist system as it then existed were very real. And we were under no illusions that our adherence, broad adherence to the Western position, had also its costs, in political terms, but also with economic ramifications.
From every direction, the economic and political climate was growing worse. Not since the 1930s had unemployment risen to such an all-time high. Clouds of debt burdens were steadily growing heavier. International financial aid was quickly fading, and regional poverty levels began increasing, even as the international arms race swallowed up some $500 billion annually.
So the Cold War fractured the international system, and in so doing increased the costs that countries had to pay for trying to position themselves within the system.
In the 1980s, you then had externally driven policies relating to structural adjustment. And these policies were really not integration friendly. They were policies designed to ensure that the individual member states were able to meet international obligations, external obligations.
All of this, of course, had a very telling effect on the Treaty of Chaguaramas, as was evidenced in the behavior of individual member states.
So I think countries became preoccupied with their own domestic problems and sought to find solutions to those problems, overemphasizing, I think, the gains that they could make from imposing restrictions on their own economic dealings with each other.
A number of countries, if not all, within the Caricom movement were forced, or at least considered themselves forced, to look inward within their own societies. And although, as at all times, they maintain an interest in export markets within CARICOM, at that time we had a phenomenon of protectionism, intra-regional protectionism, with each country looking to protect its own domestic turf as far as intra-regional trade is concerned. And that presented the integration movement with one of its most difficult challenges at the time.
The safety of CARICOM was now in the balance, and a growing sense of disregard for the Chaguaramas Treaty prevailed. After 8 years into the CARICOM process, regional heads of government had not met.
One of the fallout, I think, of the oil crisis, which you mentioned, was a very strained relationship between the leaders in Trinidad, in Jamaica, in Barbados, in Guyana, and the OECS, where it was almost impossible to get a meeting that was convenient to everybody, although several attempts were made.
I don't think we'd ever thought of ourselves as a region at that time. And so each island was thinking of what was best for that particular island. And I think that this prevented us having a unified point of view on those things.
The absence of meetings during the period you just referred to did not necessarily mean that some of them were not talking to each other. It is just that they weren't meeting formally.
The education ministers were meeting, the health ministers were meeting, industry ministers were meeting, agriculture ministers were meeting. And so we sometimes overemphasize this hiatus in terms of the longer working of Caricom.
Nobody's trying to talk with one voice in these islands. Everybody's talking their own business.
Put delicately, I would say estrangement among regional leaders. I think that was part of the problem, but I think there was a certain measure of disillusionment arising in among one, especially one powerful leader in the region. And that disillusionment came from a number of things, two of them being the failure for us to develop what we call the production integration. You know, there's an enormous hope and interest in using Trinidad's energy, for example, to put with Guyana or Jamaica bauxite to do a smelter, to do aluminium. This was a big expectation arising out of that University of West Indies study on dynamics of West Indian integration and the work of Norman Gervin and these people. It did not happen. Then there was an experience here. In fact, I was present at the beginning of that meeting in March 1976, I think it was, when Trinidad provided significant loan funds to at least 3 of the other Caricom member states, which were to be used in a certain way. Those weren't used in a certain way, and it led to a certain amount of disaffection. What other factors may have caused the disillusionment, I am not able to say. But I know there was disillusionment, certainly between one powerful leader and a lot of the others, and the situation just drifted.
Our efforts to keep Caricom afloat and maintain coordination were further affected when ideological differences began developing as a countervailing force against the accepted orthodox liberal democratic doctrines of the day.
I think ideology played a very important role. Countries in the region adopted different ideological perspectives and exhibited different ideological preferences, and that tended to move them apart. I think secondly, there was a trace of personal, difficulties among some of the leaders of the region, maybe linked to the ideological issue, and that also played a part.
We had come out of a period of the 1960s, tremendous economic growth, industrialization by invitation, open sesame for foreign entrepreneurs. But the income distribution was skewed. So regimes came to power subsequent to that period in order to address social reform internally, poverty, education, health, etc., and at the same time to get this political space in the external environment, and as the language went sometimes, either in starkly anti-imperialist terms or to restructure or accommodate the relations between the metropole and the hinterland.
Well, it ranged from extreme left policies, Marxism, Leninism, to extreme right-wing policies supportive of the American position. It was a period in which the Cold War was very intense, and when countries took strong positions in the Cold War.
And coming to power were 3 governments.
NATO was important because it was in many ways the first time since independence that a government was effectively removed by force. And what was instituted was a popular quote-unquote revolution, which seemed to turn its back on the usefulness of elections. In Guyana, there was a government in power that was not freely and fairly elected and attempted to maintain itself in power in the absence of free and fair elections. The ideological struggle in Jamaica had become very intense. They were caught up in the struggles between the United States and the Soviet Union.
They all had an anti-imperialist thrust, but only the New Jewel movement in Grenada was the most consciously ideological and had within its leadership ranks hardline Leninists who had a visceral anti-imperialism and anti-Americanism.
The thinking of these people was so different to the other leaders, and so it was a difficult scene for us to adopt.
It was difficult for the Caricom member governments to agree on what I would call a common economic philosophy.
And I recall V.C. Bird at Ocherias after we hadn't had a Caricom meeting for 7 years, and there was a strong movement in the caucus to kick out Grenada. And I remember, and it's recorded, I think, that the former Prime Minister, the late Prime Minister, pointed out to them that we were not there just in our own ego capacities. We were there representing the people. And Archbishop represented the people of Grenada, even though we did not agree with the methodology used to get there. And so to exclude him would, in a sense, bring some kind of a fracture to Caricom.
So what would Caricom do in those circumstances?
West Indians will always be West Indians. We are by temperament, interests, very, very one people. And I don't think that anything will ever change that.
So Caribbean people, as always, address these matters in a pragmatic way. And they say, well, we'll have ideological pluralism. You do your thing, but within limits. And among the limits was, let us not do anything to weaken the Caribbean integration movement. Let us try to coordinate elements of foreign policy which we can coordinate. And we agree to disagree in relation to others. We will not criticize you publicly. We will talk to you privately, restrain you from doing things which we believe might be extraordinarily harmful, but defending you in public nevertheless on matters where you exercise in your independence. So it was a pragmatic response, and to a large degree it was successful in holding the region together. Of course, the Americans have an understanding of what is taking place. In the case of Jamaica, as we know, the record now shows that the CIA went into Jamaica and assisted in the destabilization of the Manley government. Grenada self-destructed with some assistance from the United States of America.
By the time the skies had cleared following the hurricane of events in Grenada, the peoples of the Caribbean community could only sit and watch at how easy it was for their dream to change into a nightmare.
Remember that the decade of the 80s was described as the decade of lost development.
In the 1980s, we had the debt crisis. We had structural adjustment programs coming over and affecting most of the countries.
Throughout the Third World, including the Caribbean, starting with the Mexican crisis in '83. It spread. The contagion effect was there. And by the mid-'80s, practically every country had to pay increasing attention to containment of the debt crisis.
During that period, one of the major issues was the restructuring of the economies of Caricom countries, particularly efforts to deal with the economic problems in Jamaica and Guyana.
So that whereas the Mexicos and the Argentinians and others were able to do some rescheduling of their commercial debt, we didn't have that possibility. We were stuck with a debt servicing requirement that had bore no relation to our capacity to service it.
But the world could not and would not stand still and wait for Caricom as it went into dry dock. Neither could Caribbean peoples afford the luxury of time. Consequently, leaders had to meet. In quick succession, 1982, Ocho Rios, Jamaica. 1983, Port of Spain, Trinidad. 1984, Nassau, Bahamas.
With the resumption of the meetings of the heads of government, this first meeting after a long hiatus in '82 in Jamaica, they immediately started to address the issue, although there were still at that time different ideological tendencies among some of the leaders. Nevertheless, they started to take seriously the challenge of equipping the community with the necessary policy and programs to aid this process of adjustment that I mentioned, that both the world and the region, various regions around the world, had to go through in response to the oil shocks of early 70s and of 79. And a number of things were decided in Ocho Rios in October '82, that the regional movement had to crank itself up in terms of the capabilities of the Secretariat, in terms of the role and function of other regional entities. For example, the Caribbean Development Bank, which played a major role, the bank and its leadership, and the other key institutions of Caricom. There was a fresh energy, so to speak, being breathed into all these institutions to start addressing this major task of adjustment to the new world that was resulting from the oil shocks. So much so that the heads agreed to meet again within 6 months.
This meeting, Mr. Chairman, provides us with at least 4 central challenges. First, it allows us to reflect and appraise developments within the community and to see how we have complied with the principles embodied in the Treaty of Chaguaramas. Secondly, during this summit, we should also have the opportunity to address our failures with a sense of renewal in our efforts to address the political, economic, and the social challenges facing the community.
Well, it was a changed world. The whole East-West situation was beginning to change.
During this conference, we should seek the means and master the will